Góðan daginn, verið velkomin í Listasafni Íslands. Birta heiti ég, Birta Guðjónsdóttir. Ég starfa hérna sem deildarstjóri sýningardeildar. No worries for those who are not non-Icelanders. We are doing the talk in English today, so I switch already, and you're most welcome for a discussion of art theorist, writer Jón Proppé with artist, writer and curator Henrik Andersson, who is the curator of this project Comparative Vandalism, in which we are sort of setting ourselves and sitting in. I will make it very brief. I urge you to make yourselves comfortable and just come closer. There is no coincidence that we are placing ourselves around the table of which we are presenting in the show. It is mainly because we would absolutely love to have a discussion with all of you and your contributions into the talk. So feel free to contribute to a talk with any questions and comments you might have. I give the word to Henrik Andersson, and I want to say first and foremost to give my thanks to both of you for the collaboration. I'm very happy about this project taking place at the National Gallery of Iceland, and for collaborating with both of you, with Henrik as a curator and with Jón, whom we asked to expand in his text, which you can see and please take with you or take a look at while we are here, which you will find in handouts as part of the exhibition. So I guess we will start with, if I may ask Henrik to sort of give us a formulation, to give us an insight into your project, and then we will expand and enjoy.
Sure, thank you, and thank you all for coming. I'm very happy to see you all and to have you all around this table, because this is how this installation of this research archive material is intended to work. It's not a sublime imagery. This is for someone to study rather than being overwhelmed by something. I would just give you sort of some keys to this material that we have in front of us, and then we'll talk a little bit here, me and John, and then I will be most glad if someone would come with remarks or questions or ideas about this. Because this is an unfinished project by Asger Jorn. Many people know Asger Jorn as this modernist abstract painter. If someone knows him a little bit more, knows that he was involved in avant-garde movements, revolutionary movements, like numerous, like Bauhaus Imaginist or the Situationist International movement. But alongside all his other activities within the art field, he also were very interested and worked extensively on art history. It developed over the years, and he had this grand idea to make a 32-volume book that would cover Nordic art history, and the title for it was 10,000 Years of Nordic Folk Art, which in itself is very grand. But this project, initially he had very much support from friends and academics and scholars that supported this project. He himself, together with photographers, went around throughout Scandinavia, France, Germany, even Romania, I think, and Iceland, to document art historical artifacts. And this continued intensively for about 10 years. And in 65, 66, it came to a halt. Scholars sort of couldn't see the need or the purpose of his intention. Probably because of Jorn's sort of approach to art history. He regarded he regarded this type of archaeology that he was doing as an artistic process, and also meant that archaeologists sort of lacked the closeness to the material in which they were involved in, and felt that artists had a much more closer relationship to this material, and therefore artists should be involved in the process of archaeology or art history. But eventually, I mean, it failed. He only managed to produce one book in 200 copies on his own sort of editor, but apart from that didn't happen. He published many other books, but not in this series that was his main task. So what I just did was around about the 100 years anniversary, and I lived on this little island in the Baltic for some time called Gotland. And sort of kind of just, I knew about Asger Jorn, I knew about the Situationists, but I just realized, okay, he's buried here. Why? And if you know Asger Jorn, you know there is something communicating here. So he's buried in this remote area. So I looked up this story, and I found this. It's not a secret, but in the basement of his estate in Silkeborg in Denmark, in Jutland, this photographic archive rests. And just to make it's so grand, it's 50,000 photographs approximately from all over Europe. But to make a sort of a selection, I focused just on his Gotland trip, which was in '64, and the aim was for me initially to try to understand his method that he calls comparative vandalism, and what is he trying to do. So by just showing this material, it's an invitation to try to be acquainted with his method. So it has been shown in Moderna Museet in Stockholm and in Gotland, and now Birta brought this here, I guess, to try to create a narrative regarding this material as well. And it turns out when we bring it here and we talk to people about it, more Icelandic connections keep emerging with Jorn. And so by this, I think I turn to you, Jón.
Now, this is a very interesting project. Of course, as you can see, it's a very unusual exhibition. There's nothing on the walls except for the picture of Jón's gravestone, but the material is all here. And maybe this was part of the reason why he didn't really manage to complete the project as he wanted, because it was, well, I don't think people really quite understood what he was doing. It was not scientific enough for the scientists and maybe not artistic enough for the artists. So neither the scientific world nor the art world could really sort of pick up on his theme. Of course, now 50 years later, this has become very much established practice in the art world. Art as research, or research as art. And well, you cannot go to a single international exhibition really without encountering something quite similar to what Jorn was trying to do. But the motivation it's manifold, and it's actually quite interesting that Jorn turns to this project after having already, in 30 years or so, taken part in starting several artistic movements. He's one of the key figures, really, in the European avant-garde around the middle of the last century. But he had this abiding interest in folk art and also ancient art. And this, of course, was one of the big inspirations of the European avant-garde. It was this sort of turning to the primitive. Gombrich wrote a whole book, art historian, a whole book about this, the preference for the primitive as a defining sort of defining thought in the Western European avant-garde. And already in the 1930s in Denmark, when Jorn and a group of Danish artists, including actually Icelandic artists, Svavar Guðnason, Sigurjón Ólafsson, they started exhibiting together. They had this sort of interest in the primitive, in children's art, in African art. They used Polynesian masks and all sorts of stuff. And Asger Jorn was part of that, and he encouraged that. He wrote about that. But then, when in the late 50s and early 60s, when he turns to this project, he is trying to discover the Nordic roots, you could say. The European avant-garde turned mostly to Africa, Polynesia, artifacts from these southern countries and from the Mediterranean. If you think of Picasso, for example, in his later works with all his Minoan references and that sort of thing. But Asger Jorn thought, well, we have all this in the north, you know. We have our own history. We don't need to be drawing on medieval sources and all the time. We have our own history. And he wanted to rediscover that and document it in a creative way. And it is something quite different, really, when an artist undertakes this kind of project. There is a different methodology at work. And I really liked what you said at the opening when you introduced the show yesterday. You said this is not an artwork by Asger Jorn. This is an introduction to a methodology. So it's a more conceptual thing, you could say. Did you say I'm right?
Sure. I think you're totally right in the sort of trying to view a sort of premediated art expression within perhaps what we see here if you look at perhaps close-ups on gargoyles and stuff, you would definitely see this idea of a prime expression. But what differs him from others like Picasso, who lets themselves be inspired by imagery from far and abroad, he goes further and makes it into this on the same time as he views it as primitive. He tries to view Nordic art history in the same way as the bourgeoisie during the 19th century viewed the classical Greeks. So this is the source of civilization, right? And so he comes up with this counter narrative saying, okay, but there is another kind of more brute, more direct, perhaps more not sophisticated, but and he tries to make this, and he then becomes this amateur historian as well, making his own remarks. He comes with this different types of theories and ideas, which is difficult to follow because they also contradict each other, and then he introduces provocations like vandalism and which is actually quite interesting because it could be in a way difficult to understand what he's trying to do, but it works. And I realized that when the interest from journalists coming and wanted to make interviews, they sort of, but vandal, what? Are you vandalizing something? What is it? So in a sense, his provocation worked.
Yes, and what he actually uncovers, or what he highlights really in this research, which we can see even in these photographs just from the Gotland series, is that the history of Nordic art or Nordic expression in pictorial form, as we see here, is not as straightforward as perhaps people had imagined. And not as straightforward as, for example, when we tell, well, when I'm teaching Roman art history or something like that, we have a sort of pretty clear progression. The Scandinavians, they were traveling people. They were open to influences from all around the world. So here we have, in Gotland, which of course is a marvelous place, it's the greatest concentration of Nordic artifacts anywhere. I think about half the Viking treasure that has been dug out of the ground has come from Gotland. And you can tell here, there are influences from all over the world, and they're overlaid on each other. There's rune stones from the Viking age reused in medieval churches. There's graffiti on top of what may be a Nordic image, or a Nordic image transformed into something which seems to be more of a medieval influence or Mediterranean influence, or etc. And the same is reflected in, for example, the treasures that have been found. There are coins from Turkey, from Mesopotamia, from Rome, from Byzantium, from everywhere. Even objects from as far away as India have been dug out of the ground in Gotland. So this idea of the vandalism is not just about destruction, it's about a kind of creative process of reworking and retelling, adopting things and mixing them up. And so it's a kind of creative vandalism, shall we say, not destructive. And that's sort of the part of the methodology that Jorn was trying to develop. And this actually connects up with his whole career. I don't really see this project as a major change in his thinking, because already back in the 30s, they were introducing these themes of primitive art, folk tales, he and his friends and so forth. And in the Situationist International, they emphasized this sort of reworking of the social situation, the world, really. They wanted to melt cultural thinking and political action, and that meant sort of going into the city, for example. They were a very sort of urbanistic movement in a way, going into the city and trying to make slight alterations in the patterns of life of people, maybe just obstructing in some way or diverting people's attention in some way. This is very much a technique that was used later in '68 in the student uprisings, using humor and sort of surreal interactions to get people to think about things in a new way. And here he's trying to get us to think about our history in a new way, our Nordic history. And he's also very much in he has an enemy, or maybe not an enemy, but because in the 19th century, Nordic art history or Nordic history was actually adopted by artists, the sort of late Romantic artists, but it was very much done in a sort of, what shall we say, fantasyful manner. These are the sort of images that we grew up with in our textbooks in school when we were reading Icelandic history, and there were these, sort of grand Vikings, Leifur Eiríksson sailing to the New World and all that. But this is what it actually looked like. This is the sort of art that was being made, and this is the visual world of those people. And it's a totally different way of thinking. A good example would be actually Sigurjón Ólafsson, friend of Asger Jorn and partner in some exhibitions in Denmark. He has a fantastic sculpture which is now on display in the Sigurjón Ólafsson Museum, which is sort of a large wooden structure of a woman, very primitive, very roughly cut with axe, etc., and it's called Fjallkonan, the Lady of the Mountains, who is sort of the Icelandic mother figure. She's like Britannia, or, and in our minds, all of us, I'm sure, we see her as a sort of 19th century woman in a long dress with a beautiful hat, a young woman, with sitting majestically like a classical figure. But Sigurjón's Fjallkona is a primitive icon, like a almost terrifying sort of godlike woman figure. And that is actually much, much closer to this sort of thing that Asger Jorn was trying to rediscover for us. So he's rewriting our visual history. And he said, like you said, that the archaeologists perhaps didn't actually have this connection, this artistic or this sort of artistic understanding of the stuff they were looking at. They just picked it up and classified it. And there's a famous joke, really, about the early sort of archaeological records that whenever it wasn't clear what an object was for, what it was used for, they would just say ritual or ludic. Ritual waf ludic. That is to say, either ritualistic object or a play or a toy. Yeah. But in most cases, this is what we should actually be looking at as art. Art doesn't serve a purpose, not in a practical sense, but it's important. And so this is sort of the rediscovery that we're looking at with this project. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to sort of carry it on to its conclusion, but he started something, and there were a few other artists around the same time starting to do this sort of thing, using research or doing artistic research. And Bent and Hilla Becker, for example, in Germany, they were investigating another kind of archaeology, the industrial buildings of Germany, something that nobody had paid any attention to. And they went around taking photographs, using photography like Jorn, taking photographs of these factories and steelworks and God knows ugly things, but looking at them in an artistic way, looking at the aesthetics of these buildings. And at the time, everybody thought they were crazy. And it wasn't until 20, 30 years later that museums finally sort of picked up on, and the art world in general picked up on, hey, this is beautiful stuff, let's show this. And hopefully we're starting to see the same with this, with Asger Jorn's project, because it definitely deserves more attention than it has had.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm thinking about is that his motives regarding this, and from the perspective of of abstract art, to be an abstract painter, a modernist painter. This looking for and seeking inspiration from the prime and the art is, I look at it as escape attempts, because the abstract art sort of is a constant renegotiation of autonomy, saying, okay, in order for my painting to work, it needs sort of an understanding of it as something that can exist on its own terms. The only problem is, in order for that to work, we need a space which is conceived as neutral. We need money, we need staff, we need text, we need a lot of stuff. And these things are always a problem. It's what you always need to negotiate with. If you want to. And when you look at Jorn's work and what it says, he seems very restless. He seems very he has a problem with this. He has a problem with his growing popularity. He has a problem with winning awards and stuff like this. The famous Guggenheim telegram where he sends, "You can take your bloody money. I don't want your money." So along come, and if you read André Malraux, the Museum Without Walls text, Museum Imaginaire, which much of this work is based on, or a mockery of, or hacking into, one little sentence saying that, okay, in the medieval times, a sculpture of the Madonna was not the sculpture of the Madonna, it was the Madonna. So you would have all these imagery that doesn't really represent things in that sense that we think of them today, like an image of the devil. It represents evil, or it is evil. It is, or it has ability to create fear, or something like this. And to an artist, of course, this is especially someone who is so dependent on the autonomy of his artwork. I see this much as an escape attempt to move into and try to connect with something. And of course, working with photography is always difficult. At the same time as what photography does, it creates distance, it creates difference, which is a problem if you want to. It's a very good, effective way if you want to use reason and try to understand, but it's very not good if you want to be part of something. But perhaps that's the only way we have. If we want to be part of something, we need to make it into a photograph, because that's the only place for renegotiations so it is an impossible mission from start,
that's part of it. And we were talking the other day about this. In a sense, it's starting out to document 10,000 years of Nordic art. It's like if I decided tomorrow that I wanted to catalog and photograph every rock in Iceland, it's impossible. It cannot be done. There are too many of them, and they're all different. But they're all interesting. If you stop and look at it. So even just as an unfinished project, we can look at this as a magnificent conceptual art piece. Just sort of having the idea, I'm going to start now, and I'm going to document all of it, and I won't give up until I'm done. And this is the kind of energy and determination that Jorn had shown his whole life, with all the different movements that he was part of and took part in founding. He was one of the sort of most energetic and driving figures in all these movements. And when you talk about an escape attempt, it's sort of strange because throughout his career he is sort of escaping from something into something else, and most often escaping in some sense, trying to escape from his own success. In Denmark after World War II, the Helhesten movement group and this larger group of artists, they were recognized as the most important people in Danish art after the war. And Asger Jorn was in a position to become, one of the leading artists of Denmark. He decides to go to Paris instead, where he was relatively unknown, and starts new movements. And when Cobra becomes a great success and they're getting exhibited all over the world, he starts another movement, which is totally different. The situation is the lettrists. And then when the lettrists sort of dissolve or change into something that he didn't quite like anymore, he goes on to this new project. So, it's hard to understand because hell, he had it made. He could have been the top artist in Denmark, and lived, to a ripe old age, making 3 paintings a month and selling them for millions. But no, he didn't do that. He had to go do something else and do something different. So there is this sort of searching, creative spirit. And that's what he brought to all his projects. It was this energy and this sort of constant need to look at things in a different way, and to somehow work that into his art. And you're right about this. The abstract artist, of course, is constantly struggling, negotiating this space. Saying, yes, this is art. It may not look like art, but yes, it is art. Believe me, buy it. And it takes a lot of energy to do this. But at the same time, he's always thinking of the larger sort of group. When he was working in these artist groups in Denmark, he was the one who sort of pulled everyone together, helped made sure everyone was on going along and taking part in the exhibitions and all that. With the Situationists, he was writing all these manifestos and letters and stuff, keeping the group moving, and with this project, he seems to be thinking of all of us in the north, the whole Nordic nation, you could say, that he has in mind, and he's trying to take us along on this journey into our own past. And I think it's just a beautiful project.
Yeah, I mean, there are at the same time. I mean, just so you know, there is. In this situationist movement, there is actually a split between a sort of a continental Europe part or a French part and a Scandinavian Nordic part, and some argue that it wasn't actually a split. It was but it doesn't really matter. But in 61, 62 they actually launched this idea. Jorn launches this idea of Scandinavian Institute of Comparative Vandalism. And together with his brother Jørgen Nash, they produce a magazine called Drakabygget, which was a farm where his brother lived. But they called it a magazine against popes, politicians, and atomic bombs. and it had this Scandinavian, and I think the reason for it is that at the time Denmark was doing some negotiations towards what would become the EU, which he didn't approve of. So they launched this, and they called to a diktamöte, so a writers' meeting at Himmelsberg it's outside of Silkeborg, and he calls upon a Norwegian writer and a Swedish and Halldor Laxness to come to sort of create a pan-Nordic alternative. But this thing was also very much of a. And then he uses the same logo as he uses for this quite serious project, and he launches, and they two together launches they go into newspaper magazine. Okay, now this very big super cultural summit is going to take place in Himmelsberg this summer, and it's going to be big, it's going to be huge, and it didn't happen at all. I don't know if it was ever intended for Halldor Laxness to show up, or what he should have done there, or no one really knows. But this is also just part of this situationist way of dealing with media. It was an art project, maybe, but it was serious, but not, and I think it actually worked against his other ambitions with the more serious parts of it.
Perhaps in some ways, yeah. But now that you mentioned Halldor Laxness, maybe we've come to sort of the Icelandic detail in this process, because, of course, no history of Nordic folk art for 10,000 years is complete without Iceland. And Asger Jorn came here to Iceland in 1968, wasn't it? 1967. Of course, he already knew quite a lot about Iceland. He had friends here. He had worked with Svavar Guðnason and Sigurjón Ólafsson. He knew some other Icelandic artists as well. But he came here to organize the documentation of Icelandic antiquities and folk art, and was in contact with Selma Jónsdóttir, whose centenary we're celebrating this week. First director of this museum, and herself an art historian who wrote about medieval art in Iceland. So he wanted her to work with him to organize the collection of photographs of artworks in Iceland, and quite a lot of those photographs were actually made. They've never been exhibited, and we're now in the process of sort of trying to find out where they are, to see if we can take a look at them. Maybe that'll be another exhibition someday. So there is an Icelandic connection here, and I think, because I've studied and written a lot about Svavar Guðnason and that period in Danish art history before and during the Second World War, it's quite clear that there was a very special connection between Svavar and Asger Jorn. They were best friends in the movement. There were a lot of other artists around, but there was something special about their connection. And Svavar was not an easy man to get along with, so that's quite remarkable actually for Asger to make such good friends with him. But I think what Asger always admired in Svavar, in his person, in his character, but primarily, of course, in his work, was this sort of primitive streak that he had. There's this sort of daring, almost sort of Viking mentality towards the canvas and art and the art scene. And Svavar was, like Asger Jorn, strangely indifferent to success. I mean, after the war, Svavar could also have been one of the great artists of Denmark. He and Asger Jorn could have just sat there at home in their studio, made paintings, and been rich and respected in Danish society, but neither of them did. Asger Jorn went to Paris, Svavar came home to Iceland. and stayed here. And famously, Thor Vilhjálmsson, who wrote a short biography of Svavar Guðnason, he mentioned that when he came to visit Svavar, he noticed that there were piles of unopened envelopes, and some of them were even from big art museums around Europe, and Thor asked if he could open some of these, and Svavar said, yeah, sure. And there would be invitations to come exhibit at the grandest museums in Europe, and he hadn't even opened it, and the letter was 3 years old. They had this sort of strange Nordic, or what I sort of like to think of as a sort of Nordic independence, men of the mountains, even if it's only Himmelbjerget.
Yeah, I guess what you're talking about is actually also still in a negotiation of autonomy. So the only strategy, I mean, even though perhaps Svavar wasn't that conscious about his decision to withdraw, it still fits into the idea of avant-garde, of someone who's perhaps not ahead. Avant-garde actually could mean that you're sort of also behind your. You could be retrograde. It's kind of the same thing, so in a way, that's the only way for Svavar to do what he does. To neglect the outside, that's how you become attractive.
Yeah, well, perhaps, yeah. But we've been talking for quite a long time, and I think we should invite some comments and questions from the audience. Anyone like to argue with us, add something, contradict us, vandalize the seminar? So no vandals in the room. No. No.
Maybe I can
Yes.
start with like a small, it's maybe less of a question than a comment to ask you to reflect on. Again, what you mentioned in the beginning of the conversation, this element of, this, how just to sort of, because one of the aims of presenting this project for you and for us at this moment is also for us to reflect on different meanings at the time and then today, and how can we, which learnings can we draw from this now, and even furthermore, how can we actually explore further? And there are so many like really key concepts, issues at stake at the time when Jorn is working on this project that are still absolutely the same. Even terms, as you mentioned, such as conflicting terms, such as research, the way we look at history, who has the right to analyze and by which means, and so on and so forth. But I wanted to maybe touch a little bit on what you mentioned with a prevailing view of perhaps so-called primitivism, which is even a term which I don't know if we use it anymore except to refer to a past way of thinking, right? So a certain way of thinking of primitivism in the North, and then this sort of comparing of how the Western mentality looks at Greek art, and the sort of primitivism meaning the primitive an origin of thought, an origin of it's a scattered thoughts, but it would be so nice to hear your reflections.
Yes, well, of course, that's one of the wonderful things that we see when we look at these old objects in Gotland through through Asger Jorn's eyes, so to say, or through the lens of his photographer's camera, is that in a lot of cases there's no way of actually telling really where this is from, who did this. Okay, there's probably a rune stone, but then there is something else on top, and it's all mixed up. There is we can tell that the people who made these things, they thought about the cultural world that they inhabited in some totally different way from how we think of our cultural world. We take these objects and we put them in museums. We write, a little essay about them. We try to date them. We try to analyze them stylistically, put a label on them, that sort of thing, and then we forget about them. But actually, they were used in a creative way. They were part of everyday life. They were not necessarily something to be sort of revered or taken seriously or preserved. It was to be used. And a picture of the god is not just a representation that can be put in a museum. It is the god, him or herself. And so there's this connection. Us in the 20th, 21st century looking back at this stuff, and then, of course, trying to sort of imagine how people, say, 1,000 years ago would have seen it or understood it. And, of course, we can never really quite put ourselves in their place. But we can certainly, I think, get much closer to their way of thinking by approaching this material in a creative way, not just as classifying scientists, but rather as a sort of source of creativity, source of new thinking. So with the retrograde avant-garde, that's an interesting concept we've been pulling up here. So perhaps the most avant-garde thing at some point is to look back 10,000 years and say, okay, can I try to think like an artist, a 10,000-year-old artist? That would be interesting. That would be fascinating. That would be really something to sink our teeth into. It's like what, yeah?
Just to pitch in, I mean, we're already reading on the news this year that there's a new interpretation of the Lascaux cave paintings as having been made by women, for instance. So just
yeah, exactly. I mean, this is one of the sort of stupid prejudices that come or have come with a lot of the sort of scientific research into this stuff. That, yeah, I mean, why should it have been made by men? I mean, there's absolutely no reason to think that. There's nothing that, to support that thesis, except our own prejudices.
In recent years, there has also developed feminist archaeology. When we think of gender studies, we think of it in more present time. But of course, that there's also. So I don't know if there were like feminist archaeologists that have come up with these findings or researches. But I thought also I wanted to comment on what you were saying about photography, which I understand you in the sense that photography is distant and a cold medium. But I was also thinking it's interesting still the respect that photography gives versus taking the object out of its context, uprooting it and putting it inside a museum in another part of the planet. Like
good point. Yeah.
Germans or the English. That's there's an interesting unvandalizing or a vandalizing of that method. It's documenting the thing in its place. Also the thing of the kind of unscientific or not over-scientifically, not over-categorizing the object and leaving it still to speculation what it may have been. Because the thing of categorizing, that lead to a depth of the creative. I mean, it can, it doesn't need to, but so that it's as if he kind of wanted to scan, as it were, the entire thing and see what comes out of it, kind of scanning instead of like giving a. That's what was interesting, that the photography allows for the things to stay in their place.
Yeah, I mean, there is. Yeah, I mean, of course, the early colonial powers, they went to Egypt, and if they could, they would have brought home the Cheops pyramid to London to save it. And this.
The Danes saved the manuscripts from
Yeah. But. Still, what photography enables is from this André Malraux perspective, he can take imagery out of the context, and in this shape that Jorn actually does there, you can make enlargement of small things and put them next to big things, and by comparative method suggest in a sort of suggestive psychology, create meaning. The only thing that needs to take place, you need to have a privileged position in order for that to take place. There is this famous photograph of André Malraux in his study, when he has all the photographs on the floor. It's in the Louvre, and it's photographs from Polynesia or whatever, and it can just stand there, and nothing is risking to just bite his ass or something. It's total control of himself, total control of his sexuality. He has this total. So I would say that it is actually, and the photography actually meant intensifying the colonial process. You didn't need to steal the things. You can just take photographs of them and sort of create the narrative where you were the interpreter of them. But still, they could stay in place.
There, of course, because the example you take, I mean, this is like we were talking about after the photograph for a second.
Yeah.
During the opening, of course, it's crucial to this project. One thing is photography and so on, that it is taking place in where he is coming from.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
That's a crucial
Yeah.
to the question on study of history and culture. It's a crucial difference whether one studies one's own era or someone else.
Sure.
True, and I think Asger Jorn was very aware, really, of this. I mean, he was very respectful, I think, towards the objects he was documenting, and he took a lot of time on this project. He would spend a long time, in these places in Gotland and stuff, documenting, and he spent a lot of money. He hired the best photographers in Europe to come work with him on this. And photography, yes, it does give you an opportunity to look at things in a very different way. And this comes back to Malraux, like you've been saying, that it allows us to create this imaginary museum where we can put things side by side. We can take a photograph of this and that and the other thing and put them side by side, and new meaning will be created. This happens. I mean, there's nothing we can do about it. You put 2-3 objects side by side and something new is created that is different from the 3 individual objects you brought together. There's a new meaning that gets created. And so that's a creative process. So just by going out, finding these things, photographing them and making these contact sheets, and you can just imagine Asger Jorn with hundreds of these sheets sitting around the table, moving them around and deciding what should go together, what should. That's a creative process, and it's creating something that, yes, it's art, but it's also a purer kind of creation. It's creative. It's creative thinking. It creates a new thought and a new way of thinking. And that's what he was trying to do with this. This is very much, like Henrik said yesterday, this exhibition, it's not an artwork, it's an introduction to a methodology, or maybe an introduction to a way of thinking about creating a new methodology even. So it's a very open-ended process, but at bottom, most importantly, it's a creative process, and I don't think we can deny that. And that, of course, was why Asger Jorn was so immersed in it. Now,
I had a question.
Yes?
One out of the 32 volumes that were actually published. Could you describe it a bit? Like, what was there text in it also? Was it only imagery?
Yeah, the first. I think it's the first, and it's called Stenskulpturer in Skåne 1100-tal, alltså Stone Sculptures in Skåne. And basically, the book is, on every book, he collaborated with sort of the expert in that field. So the stone sculptures of Skåne, he collaborated with archaeologist Erik Sinto from Lund, who was sort of the main authority in that field. And it just consists of, you could say that it is actually a mixture of an art book, or because there basically no text. It's just imagery of these things coming in a montage way, following his type of suggestive psychology. It introduces a text by this scholar, which is a very short, even a bit poetic text, trying to follow actually Jorn's thoughts, and so it's not the book is not provocative. It doesn't come with a sort of a grand other idea. It's just I think he sees it as an artist. He has a sort of a sensibility towards these images that he can make some type of selection that has a new meaning. It is actually a strange document. You don't really know what to make of it, even though the images are beautiful and so on. One book that he published was Langa Vert, which is more of an artist book or an art book, where he put together artifacts, photographs from whom put their tongue out. So we could have a picture of Einstein putting his tongue out next to a stone sculpture putting his tongue out, and it's just filled with those type of, and it's a reference to Levi-Strauss, the anthropologist, etc. Which is much more of a mockery, and it's a very fun, very witty book, and it functions much really as a interesting artist book. But then he sort of seemed to have left more of his more of serious ideas. There are other books by him. He wrote a lot himself. He used many of these pictures in other, but in those books he has much more to say. Has a lot of. He comes with these ideas of whatever, the usage of wood or in stone churches or whatever.
Just saying that there should be 32 volumes makes me also think that there was a kind of a grand layout for what these volumes would cover.
Yeah, he had an outline basically of the project and what would be. I mean, he didn't start out with the idea of 32 volumes. After he'd been working on this for a while, he narrowed it down to 32 volumes. and he said, okay, I can do this in 32 volumes. So yes, it was very much a thought-out project. It's, even though there is this creative element to it, this sort of interesting random element, even just in all these photographs, you can sort of, if you try to imagine being there when they were taking the photograph, you can see the photographer and then Asger Jorn, pointing and saying, oh, get this, get that, this. So that it's sort of an encounter. Asger Jorn encountering this art. There is that sort of back narrative to this whole story. This is his exploration, his investigation. And the fact that he just has them photograph it and leaves it in place, there is a certain beautiful respect to that. Like Ola was saying, you don't have to sort of remove the thing. And talking about vandalism, Asger Jorn's name for this method is sort of ironic, because I mean the greatest examples of vandalism in Western civilization are the Louvre and the British Museum, which vandalized entire countries and stole all their art. So talking about vandalism.
The title would imply that kind of, that this tongue-in-cheek aligning itself with
exactly.
other vandalist big projects.
Yeah, in a sense, yeah.
And the comparativism and the action of replacing them next to each other.
Yeah, exactly. That's just sort of bringing stuff together, looking at it, and finding connections, having new thoughts.
You mentioned the work of Proppé. I also thought of like two works that you think of in relation to Iceland. Like as research works. One was that we recently looking at Henrik Andersson.
Yes, of course.
Which was very truly scientific and accurate and detailed research work of documenting on the old houses and churches in Iceland.
He was a painter, a leader of the abstract movement here, and an architect.
And this is, of course, Asger Jorn, this curious how much, for example, Henrik Andersson might have known about this work or not, and another one would be how much Dieter Roth would have known about this work or not in relation to this document, this Reykjavik Slides project, which interestingly is not applying to professional photography, but more like casual photography, because he didn't give a damn about, or he kind of gave a damn about that it was not cool, but it was not beautiful photography.
Dieter wrote photographed, or had his friends and assistants photograph every house in Reykjavik. Twice. So,
and also actually the thing related to this is the thing of wanting to encompass everything. The magazine for everything. Obviously, from the beginning, a not possible endeavor. From the first.
Yeah, and Dieter's working method with the magazine was very interesting, because he just had his friends send in stuff, and when the pile on his desk had reached 5 centimeters or something, it was ready for publication. And he just sort of shuffled them up, arranged them, and sent them to the printers. So it was another example of this sort of endless task. And it ran to something like 40 volumes or something, I think. That's quite a lot of stuff. But yes, now we're getting to the end of this, or sort of getting close to it. We've been here more than an hour already. Henrik, would you like to sort of leave our guests with a final thought?
Yes, just one final remarks actually. And I'm sitting here thinking about the avant-garde, and we talked about time, sort of placing sort of certain imagery before ourselves. And when I went to art school, the avant-garde was dead. It was almost, to bring that question up was almost like an insult. Avant-garde meant someone being ignorant or being patronizing even, but actually, from meeting this material and meeting Jacqueline de Jong, who was with Jorn, I've totally needed to unlearn this. And what I really come to the conclusion that if the problem that we face is that if it's not avant-garde, so what kind of time is it then? Is it, okay, so it's the contemporary. We live with contemporary art, contemporary images. That means that there are images that are not contemporary, that relate to another time. Well, and to me, that is increasingly problematic to refer to it. And I would like to see this material as something that would create sort of an anti-contemporary, saying that no, these things, they exist now. They created within a context of medieval, but they exist now. They have a meaning now, and we can't place any culture in a different time. We can. So this is what I'm thinking through this material right now.
That's a very interesting thought. Steinkrimur wanted to add something, I think.
There's one aspect, and it's vandalism, which is, I think, important to notice, is that Jorn is also talking about one part. He's talking about, just a moment, about the north of the walls of Roman Empire. And he also mentioned the difference between Nordic and South, artists in the South, is that in the South the artists is serving the church and nobility and kings and so on. But the artists in the North, they were independent. They had some freedom. And when you see some of the pictures, as I see in these books, and it's mentioned that they are adopting, in the North, they are adopting gods, and they take swords from the Romans and use it, and they use everything. It's like,
there is this sort of creative reworking.
that is the idea of the North, that they were independent, they were not serving a king. But also, it's also important to see, or notice, that he imagined and thought that there was maybe some truth in it. But first came the picture, and then the story unfolds.
Quite possibly, yes.
But in the South, they had first the words and then the picture.
Well,
But he was
yeah.
trying to make a difference. You know? We are different. We are.
To some extent, yes.
If I may,
Yeah.
I really wanted to close it up, but it takes time to get the thing. But I have been thinking of the Vandal thing as well, and I was wondering, if it was coming from the, just quite ignorant of the project, but it's interesting in relation to what you were saying about colonialism, because actually Vandals, and vandalism has come, is a mocking word, but it's the same as how the Manists were given the name Manists by not themselves but by their enemies. So the word to be a vandal, the word vandalist by the other. So they were not the vandals that called themselves, but not the gave, so that's a colonial view on.
Yes, of course. It's a Roman view of the northern tribes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe there is an inverted.
Very much so.
He's actually, that's like in the Netherlands when I don't remember the name, what it's called, when you take on the name that then gives you as a mocking name. You take it as a self-empowering. And that's like there's a famous movement, I don't remember its time in the Netherlands in the 1700s or whatever, that would call it something from the enemies that they took on the shot tanks or whatever. The shot tanks movement or something. And that's, so he's maybe also like taking it on consciously, like Museum of Vandalism. Okay, you call me vandalist, I would call it the Museum of Vandalism.
Precisely. So there are a lot of sides to this project, and so even though this exhibition may, when you first come in, not look like much, not much on the walls, there is quite a lot of stuff to delve into. And Birta and the museum have been able to gather quite a lot of books that are available here to look at and read. So we hope that all this is very much in the spirit that Asger Jorn would have liked to see it presented in, even though it is an unfinished project and very much sort of in the archive state still. I think that's the sort of journey that he would have liked us to come along with him on, to delve back into not just our Nordic roots, but into how our creative mind can work and develop forward, and showing us that this stuff is very much contemporary even today. Shall we?
Just to close, thanks very much for a conversation that obviously could go on for days at an end. We will try our best to keep that conversation alive in the space. There might be more, but at least we have planned for a discussion to take place the first Sunday of October, or the second, I can't remember, about the project, about Asger Jorn, his influence. A second thing I wanted to mention, you already mentioned that we are celebrating the centennial of Dr. Selma Jónsdóttir's, here at the museum. A second relation actually to Asger Jorn's project here is that we will, in a month from now, open an exhibition at the Sigurjón Ólafsson Museum, an exhibition of the 7 works of Asger Jorn that belong to the collection of the National Gallery of Iceland, along with selected works by Sigurjón, and which will further touch on their relation and the influences both ways. So this is, you could say, a part of a sort of more of a thought of highlighting Asger Jorn's influence. So thank you very much. Takk kærlega fyrir komuna í dag.